PACT Medtech series on surviving the supply chain crisis. I want to welcome you here this morning. And first off, recognize and thank all of our sponsors and supporters. Medtech is an important area. We're going to talk, obviously, in a very pointed way about that. But grateful for our supporters, including Duane Morris. You'll hear from one of their colleagues this morning. For Baker Tilly, Fox Rothschild, and the PENN Center for Innovation. This morning's program, as you're all experienced in, you are muted, but you can ask questions. So please use the opportunity in the comments box to ask questions throughout the program. We'll monitor it, and our speakers will address them. We're going to go about an hour till 9:35, and then we will go right into subject-specific roundtables. You'll be able to select the roundtable you want to go into. You can also change tables. And then we will finish up around 10 a.m. this morning. With that, let me hand the program over and introduce Lise Halpern. Lise is the president and CEO of InnoVision Medical. She'll share a little bit of background on herself, as well as introducing the other two panelists. Let me just point out one thing. You've heard me over the years, the past couple of years, talk about our Mentor Connect program that we do in collaboration with Ben Franklin to support our region's entrepreneurs. Lise is a part of that program, so we're grateful for her participation this morning. Welcome, Lise.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, PACT, for sponsoring this program. I think this is an important and timely topic, and I'm delighted to have with me today two experts on some of the particular issues that we struggle with in supply chain in the medtech space. And I'm going to ask them each to give their own background. For me, I have spent 30 plus years in medical technology and medical devices, primarily with startups, but also with some larger companies, usually leading the commercial effort. And one of those companies, I worked with Richelle Helman, who is our regulatory expert. And I'll let her share her background. And also, Richelle, maybe share a little bit of your recent experience with the challenges in the supply chain space.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. I am Richelle Helman. I am a senior regulatory consultant currently at MEDIcept in Massachusetts, and helping many companies try and work through getting products that they got cleared under emergency use, as Lise alluded to, through the regulatory process. I, like Lise, have over 30 years in the medical device space. I've worked in anything from small startups to Fortune 500 companies, and worked in R&D, quality, and regulatory. Most recently, before joining MEDIcept, I worked at a medical device company that was in the respiratory space. And for 2 years of the pandemic, we're kind of going toe-to-toe with ventilator companies because we use some of the similar parts. And so we faced a lot of challenges in our supply chain that we had to overcome, and I'm hoping to share some of that experience and lessons learned here this morning. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And also with us from one of our sponsors, Duane Morris, is Joel Ruffini. And Joel, he's a legal expert, and as we know, all of the supply chain issues create a lot of interesting legal situations. So Joel, could you introduce yourself and please share a little bit of your supply chain specific experience?
Sure, thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Joel Ruffini. I'm an attorney at Duane Morris. Duane Morris is a full-service law firm with over 800 attorneys around the globe. And I'm in the emerging companies and venture capital group. And so we really work with companies through the whole life cycle of the, from formation through operations to exit, and often as outside general counsel. And so as part of that, we often get engaged, setting the strategy for commercial contracting from a supplier standpoint, from a customer standpoint, because often the startups, just have a complete blank slate, and you really get to implement those, strategies for how to contract. And as a firm, I mean, we have our life sciences and medical tech practices, I believe, the largest industry group that we work with. And also we have a number of offices in Asia specifically. So we've worked with a lot of these supply chain issues, especially over the last few years. So look forward to speaking on those.
Great. Okay, so, supply chain has always been an important focus in the medtech business, having backup suppliers, monitoring for parts obsolescence, and having sustaining engineering to deal with that. These are things that are routinely done in the design process. The pandemic has created some unique supply chain challenges. During the pandemic, as Richelle mentioned, particularly if you were a medtech product that was used to treat or protect healthcare workers during the pandemic, there were a lot of challenges in getting supply and product out, and some interesting strategies that developed, including emergency use authorizations to get product releases and product changes through more quickly. After the pandemic, medtech companies, like companies everywhere, are struggling with shortages, back orders, suppliers who don't deliver or partially deliver. And like all companies, medtechs are increasing par levels, keeping more inventory on the shelf of both parts and finished goods, and redesigning for supply availability. I've had to do this myself at my company. We had a small hardware board and we couldn't get our computer chips anymore. So we now have a new computer chip in our board. There are some unique challenges for supply chain disruption for medtech companies. First, it's the criticality of the product we deliver. It makes our supply challenges more emergent, and it makes us choose our business priorities more carefully because we have to really keep a focus on our patient priorities, and we allocate product through a supply shortage a little differently than other industries do. And given the fact that we use parts that are used by products that have much larger volumes, while we feel our supplies are critical, our suppliers may not, and that creates some unique challenges. Of course, we also operate in a highly regulated, risk-managed environment, and product changes that are easy to do in other industries create a significant burden in change management and regulatory submissions. And that's where I'd like to start today, and ask Richelle the question of, what kind of product changes trigger regulatory submissions when you're replacing parts and materials? What does that look like? And what does that mean to timeframes and profitability?
Yeah, so anything that you change that is really going to impact the way that the product works. So let's say, not to use a med device, or just use a mask, let's say. Let's say you can't get the materials for the front of that mask and you need to change the material. That could have a really important impact on how you breathe through that mask, how it filters particulate. So that's something where you'd have to do a lot of testing and try and get, the same material from a different supplier. Because if not, that's something that's going to trigger you to have to notify the Food and Drug Administration, and anything that contacts the patient is really where you have to think hard about, well, can I really change this material and do it quickly? If you already have a cleared product, one of the easier things to do potentially is something called a special 510K. And so that will have a 30-day review clock instead of 90. So you're saving yourself almost a quarter of profitability by being able to get to market sooner. And some of the challenges that we found in components was not necessarily the material or the part, but our current supplier was supplying that part to so many similar companies. We had to find alternate suppliers. And I think we're going to talk about it later as far as long term, but how do you have that kind of network of suppliers that you can tap into when you're in crisis mode? And so in the short term, you're kind of acting in crisis mode, trying to find anybody that has anything similar that's going to work in a similar fashion. And you're spending a lot of time doing testing to make sure that the new component works the same way as the old one.
So you're talking about there's really two impacts here, right? One is the impact in the testing you have to do in your own quality system and record, and the other is the regulatory submission.
Yes, and then even if you decide that you don't need to go to the FDA, because let's say you find the identical component from another supplier, from a quality management system standpoint, you have to go through the process of qualifying that supplier and then testing the part to make sure that the part acts in the way that you expect it to. So I think that there's a much heavier burden internally in making sure that you maintain your quality compliance. A lot of times you're not triggering a submission to FDA because you don't have the time to do the kind of testing you would need to do if you, let's say, for example, changed a material. You have to go through all the biocompatibility testing, and that's, an 8 to 12 week process. And if you're trying to stay on the market and serve your customers, you don't have that kind of time. So I think when you're in a supply chain crisis, you get very creative in your design. And well, can I, if I change my manufacturing and I do this step instead of that one, can I, use a piece that's 2 inches shorter because that's what the supplier is telling me they can get me. So I think it leads to a lot of creativity, which is a good thing.
And what about the decision process in terms of when you go to the FDA? Is there, are there?
Yeah, there's actually, FDA is, in some ways, they are very specific and give you a lot of guidance, but there's also gray around it. So as I mentioned, if you change anything that's going to fundamentally change what the device is supposed to do, you're going to have to go to FDA. If you change the material and it's not a material that you've ever used before and it raises new questions of safety, you're going to have to submit to FDA. And that's where if you already have the product cleared, there's a shorter review and approval process. If you don't, then, to be honest, you're probably going to be out of market for at least 6 months by the time you submit to FDA, go through 1 or 2 rounds of questions, and then get the clearance for the product.
Okay. And Joel, Richelle mentioned suppliers offering substitute products or things that are close but not exactly the same, and that may work very well in other industries but create more problems, as Richelle mentioned, in Medtech. Are there ways to protect in the contracts or things that we should be aware of?
Yeah, if you're a supplier and you're in a situation where you can't supply the product, there's generally a duty to mitigate damages. And so, offering a substitute product is, it's a step that suppliers can take to, try and accommodate a customer. But I also think it's really important to be, communicating to the customer, so that if they need to get that substitute product, they can get it far enough in advance. Richelle mentioned, getting like the 30-day versus 90-day, substitution. Just communicate and try and work with the customers to, help them with the changes they need to make.
So let's stick on the communication theme for a minute. As medtech companies, we have our own customer base that we supply, and we have our own contractual obligations, standing orders, things like that. What happens when we can't fulfill? Are there ways to ease our relationship with our customers when we can't deliver, say, the volume of product or exactly the same product that we committed to?
Yeah, sure. Again, I think communication is key with that as well. Talk to the customers and see which ones, really need the product immediately, which ones may have some flexibility on maybe pushing out some delivery times. And that might help with, allocating inventory. And, maybe if you are the supplier, maybe you can find some substitute goods to meet the demand, and you can work with customers that way. I think the customer service, expectation is a little bit higher than the, contractual obligation. And so, you really want to be doing everything you can to keep a, happy, satisfied customer, because that's kind of of core importance. if you're kind of past that point where, maybe the customer, satisfaction is going down, I would also say really look at what the contract says and really see what the contractual obligations are, discuss it with, counsel. There can be requirements that really do place, the immediacy of you need to deliver by a certain date. There can be ways that performance can be delayed or excused. And I think that very frequently people get into a course of practice where, there may be a customer and vendor relationship where that may not exactly match the contract because you are trying to, meet the customer satisfaction expectations. You're trying to deliver a product, to make the customer happy, and that, may be on terms more favorable to the customer than what are actually required under the contract. And so, I would say if you're at that point, look at what the contract says and really see what you are obligated to do. And that can also be used as a way of negotiating. You can point out what the actual requirements are. It's certainly something you need to do tactfully. But when you can kind of take it back a step and just say, okay, here's what, we agreed we would do. Here's what we actually can do. And, how can we work through this to, have it work for everybody.
So I want to build on that because there's another situation that occurs, which is my supplier has now doubled my cost of product. And I can't afford to supply my customer at the price that we agreed. Any tips or strategies for how to have that rather difficult discussion?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And actually, so at least many courts won't excuse performance for an increased cost. That's often considered something that's it's too bad for the vendor if their own suppliers have increased costs. It can be an excuse for performance if it's due to what's often called like a force majeure event or something. For instance, the war in Ukraine. If you have a contractual clause that says, force majeure event is war, and you're sourcing a good coming from an area affected by that, maybe you have an argument. But I think more than that, I think if you're in communication with your customers and you're discussing the challenges you're facing, maybe some moderate price increases, can be worked through. If it's such an extreme price increase where you just can't deliver something profitably, that's a problem. It needs to be worked through. If it's, something moderate, if one component is doubling in price, and the overall cost of the good is, can still be delivered profitably, that maybe is something that can, be reflected with a moderate price increase. But we're also seeing, some of the pricing risks be passed on, to customers, where, particularly if there's a commodity that, has volatile pricing, it'll just be, in the contract, it'll be, cost of acquisition, at market prices. And so that pricing risk is, I think, in some instances being passed on to customers. So rather than the supplier taking the entire price risk, they'll just say, we're focused on assembling those raw materials, but the raw materials cost what they cost, and that's just what the end product's going to come out at.
And to build on that, you talk about the price increase coming in and wanting to not increase the price to your customer. That's where we got creative in what was in our control, which was our manufacturing. And so we were lucky, we were building more product. And so we had more product lines. And so we were able to cut our overhead because we were producing more product. But then we also sent one of our, manufacturing lines offshore, because they're, to diversify where the labor was coming from, so that if COVID hit in the US but didn't hit offshore, we still had a factory that could be up and running. So I think, we're talking mostly about supply chain, but I think our supply chain was really good about looking about what could we do internally to diversify in case we got into that situation where, the supplier really jacked up the price because they couldn't get the labor, or they couldn't get the components, or the components they were getting, the price went up. And then also kind of going to what you were talking about before, Lisa, about triaging. We actually had a triage team, and we had our, field team on the ground contacting hospitals to say, okay, you placed an order for, 50 cases. Do you really have that many patients? And so we were kind of looking at hospitalizations across the country and managing our, supply and where we were shipping product based on the COVID numbers of hospitalization. Because we're like, okay, you're ordering this much because your area of the country is seeing all this COVID. Whereas if, somebody in another area of the country where they had like very few hospitalizations, we would call them and say, hey, if you're, stockpiling this, we're not going to be able to meet the customer demand of those who really need it. Can we, ship it to you in 2 weeks instead of right now? And most times the customers were really understanding, even if they had a contractual agreement that, okay, you're going to send us 30 cases every month. We called them, and we personally didn't find a lot of problems with the, having to change the contract that way to postpone shipment.
Yeah, I think it's what you want them to remember coming out of the shortage is not the experience of the shortage, but of the positive experience of partnering with you as a supplier to the customer. Talking a little bit about the pandemic, can we talk about, from the regulatory perspective, the Emergency Use Authorization, which a lot of companies use to get products out or get changes out quickly? And, where is that now? What happens to those products now?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, any products that could foreseeably help with either alleviating symptoms or treating people with COVID, there were enforcement policies and emergency use authorizations. And basically that said, if you can get us very basic information that shows that what you're going to provide is going to help in some way, shape, or form and not cause harm, we want it on the market. And so there was very kind of, from a regulatory perspective, low burden of what you had to produce and provide to FDA. And that's why you'll see there's a lot of companies that came on with masks, with humidifiers, with cannulas, anything that could help respiratory. They all came on the market. And as I said, as long as you had enough information so that FDA felt that you were doing more help than harm, you got clearance. And under the emergency use authorization, you could put your product on the market. I think FDA is being actually pretty generous to industry. They recently introduced 2 draft guidances for comment, and all comments were due in March, and they don't expect the final guidances to be issued this year. So, and once the enforcement policies end and the emergency use authorizations are revoked, you have 180 days to submit to FDA and get your product cleared. And unless you're, a high-risk class 3 device, that should be enough time for you to get cleared, but you shouldn't wait for those 180-day clocks to start from FDA. They've kind of raised the warning flag, I'll say, to say, okay, if you want to keep your product on the market, once we remove this emergency use authorization, start working on it now, and start putting your submission together, work with FDA, and FDA has said all you have to do is have your submission accepted by us before that 180 days ends. But it takes a while to get through. It could take you about a month going back and forth with FDA for them to actually accept the submission. And then they have to really substantially start reviewing it. So we are encouraging any clients that have worked with us before, and we're kind of going on social media saying, don't wait. Start now, and if you need help, we can help guide you. And then there are others who really just got into the market to take advantage for lack of a better word, of the pandemic and don't plan to stay on the market. And even those companies have to notify FDA that they don't plan to continue to distribute the product, because FDA wants to make sure they know that, even if this becomes endemic instead of pandemic, that there's still going to be a need for more supply than there was in the market pre-COVID. And so they, want to get an understanding of, okay, are all of these companies going to stop producing their product? And so we're going to be kind of in a shortage situation again, or there are going to be enough people that want to stay in this space and continue to produce their product. And FDA wants to know that too, so they can plan resources for reviewing all the submissions that may come their way.
So is this going to have an impact, as people are dealing with design changes and lots of, small submissions for design changes, given the shortages now? Do you expect that there's going to be a backlog of, are there enough EUAs that it's going to create challenges?
I think if they don't continue to use other branches of the Food and Drug Administration, they will. So that's one of the things that we're seeing is submissions that we're putting in areas that don't have to do with the pandemic. The resources are very thin because they've all been devoted. And so I think that's what's going to continue is if you've got a device that had emergency use authorization or it fell under the enforcement policy, they're still going to be applying all the current resources to that. So it's actually going to have more impact on a product that doesn't. So for example, Lise, let's say the product that you work on became a regulated product. You're the one who's going to have a more drawn out regulatory process because the resources in those other areas have been spread thin to just kind of keep it minimally going.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But that's one of the reasons that FDA is kind of saying now, put your submission in now, because the more you wait, then they are going to have that backlog and it will impact review and approval times.
Okay. I'd like to turn a little bit towards sort of lessons learned out of this, and how we think it's going to change the future. Some of the questions that have come up from people dealing with the current supply chain is, should we change our design practice? Should we get multiple products in our supply chain cleared in our first clearance? Any thoughts or tips of, what could help, what we've learned from this that could help us in the future? Let me start with Richelle and then go to Joel.
Okay, that sounds like yeah. So from our perspective, I think what we've learned is, kind of just at least from a quality management system perspective, always have a second source. Try and minimize your sole source supplying. Because that way, if supplier and also diversify where your suppliers are located, because if all your suppliers are in one place and they get hit with a natural disaster or another pandemic, your supply chain is gone. So that's one of the big things we learned was diversity in supply chain, and then flexibility in our manufacturing space. Be able to, we need more of this than that. Be able to have flexibility to move your space around as much as possible so that you have flexibility in the things that you're doing. And then from a design and regulatory perspective, absolutely, identify alternate materials and, put, without making your submission very complex or kind of like a Chinese menu, do try and say, okay, we can use, this plastic that's blue or this one that's green, and put both in your submission at once so that you then have more flexibility because you can mix the blue and green to make some other new color and it's already covered. So I really think that, flexibility in design and not being, unless you absolutely have to make it work, don't get so design specific in your submission. Try and give yourself some flexibility in how you frame the submission. So, and when you're going through the submission, kind of go through the questions like, okay, if 6 months from now I want to do this, is it going to trigger another submission? And kind of be thinking that way through your whole design process. And I don't think a lot of companies were doing that before we got into this supply chain crisis.
Oh, same question for you. Lessons learned
Yeah, no, I think, Richelle, I think you hit it just spot on with all of that. And I mean, from like a supplier risk standpoint, I mean, I think a lot of people took for granted things that were just very readily available. I mean, things like like microchips. I mean, you saw it, everything from medical devices to auto manufacturers. They were things that were. I mean, you could put it out for bids, and somebody would say, "I can build them," and you would have your choice of vendors. And they weren't really seen as a vulnerability, and just due to a combination of factors from increased demand and supply chain difficulties. I mean, that's really been one of the significant single products, but I think it's really caused a lot of people to look at their supply chains and really see what are the single points of failure, the concentrations where you may only have one vendor supplying a component, or you may have, overexposure to one geographic area. And I think it's really caused people to evaluate those things. And so, diversifying, your vendors. So, maybe you don't, but also if there's something that only one manufacturer can produce, you can only source it from one vendor. Also just, discussing with them, what are their challenges? What can you do to help them, deliver product? Are there ways that you can work through it? And really, solidifying that relationship so that if they are a core vendor, that you just reduce the number of challenges in getting that critical component.
One of the comments, it used to be, I mean, I think we always did that with sort of these critical special components in our design. The interesting thing with this post-pandemic stage has been, it's not the special things that are in short supply. It's the things that everybody's using. I mean, the computer chip that I'm short of at my company is one that was very, very, very common and now is back ordered until 2024. Which brings to the question, we are often not the highest volume customers of suppliers. And when they're doing their own prioritization during shortage, we often are the ones that they sort of say, oh, well, they just need a little bit. So, we're going to focus on our really big customers. How do we make the case to suppliers about the criticality and can we get sort of special place on the list because our customers have this need for the product that's for the public good? So, Joel, I'll let you go first on that one. And then Richelle, I'd like your comment too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly one possibility is, I think you actually mentioned earlier, can you increase your order size? If it's a smaller order, I mean, if you have if you're fortunate enough to have the financial ability to place a large order for a more critical component, and you might be increasing, the number of days of inventory of, that particular component, but that's certainly, one option to just build up, more inventory, to place a large order and to make it a larger priority. So that's maybe one solution. And, I would also say if you have the benefit of being able to set these terms in advance, from a contracting standpoint, you can put things in there that make it clear that your expectation is, to have parts delivered on time, on a specific schedule. Often the delivery would be called, time of the essence. And so, if you're contracting for, microchips, and you're going up against a Bitcoin mining rig, they may have more money to throw around, but if you have the ability to, negotiate terms to guarantee that delivery, maybe you can just make enough noise as this is what we agreed to, that they'll, find a way to deliver those components.
Richelle?
Yeah, so we did a little bit of that where we, hadn't committed far in advance because originally the product was going to be going end of life because our next generation technology was coming out, and we, wanted high inventory turns of our components as well as our finished goods, and so we wouldn't buy a very long supplies worth of product. And so we actually looked at our supply chain, and for things that we thought might go into shortage, we ordered a 2-year supply and committed. So we said, okay, we know you can't deliver all of it now, but we're committed to this, knowing that we were taking the risk that at the end of the day, we might have 6 months of components that we were never going to use, but we wanted to make sure that we kept our supply going. The other thing that we did that was kind of, lack of a better word, ballsy, was we contacted their other customers and said, do you really need all 1,000 of those now? Or can we have 200 and you'll get your 200 back in, 4 weeks? And so we started being really creative of trying to leverage our negotiation skills to negotiate with their other customers where they failed. And not everybody's going to feel comfortable doing that. Not all of their, legal team is going to say, go for it. But we're just like, okay, it can't hurt to ask. And if you ask and they say no, well, you're not any worse off than you were. But if they surprise you and say yes, you've got another 250 parts that you can use to build your product. So I thought that was, as I said, not everybody's going to feel comfortable doing that, but it was a creative solution to try and, go toe to toe with the, bigger supply companies. To your point, Lisa, they buy 10,000 and we buy 100. They're going to, want to keep satisfied the customer who's buying 10,000. So I think that there was, as I said, a lot of creativity that came out of the process.
Okay. We actually have a question from the audience, which is, I'm curious to know how you guys are leveraging technology like your CRM, ERP systems to handle supply chain issues and, provide order transparency with your customers. So, Richelle, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So we were having daily meetings where we were getting reports out of our ERP system to know how much we had on hand of both components and finished goods. And so we started talking about it in terms of, okay, we have enough components for, 2 more months worth of shipments at the current run rate, or, the run rate has gone up to this. So we were, monitoring how many orders were going out for all the different items that we were selling and what components were needed. And on a daily basis, using reports from our ERP system to kind of say, okay, where's our current shortage? Where's our next shortage going to be? And really, but if we didn't have that in place, it stressed the system enough trying to get those reports and get the analytics correct. If you don't have an ERP system or are new to it, I'm not sure how helpful it would have been. But I think our supply chain and ops team had enough experience with it, and our financial team, and anybody who could help figure it out. We had customer service kind of mining through data and saying, yeah, that looks right. That's what we're seeing with the phone calls. This is what we're hearing from customers. And so we used the ERP system reports, but then it was kind of, experience and knowledge of the team looking at those numbers to make sure they made sense and not just, taking it at face value that what the ERP system was showing us was accurate.
Yeah. I would just add to that. We worked with a company that had the fortune of selling logistics tracking, software, pretty much going to market at the height of the pandemic. And just the willingness to work with them that they saw. For a startup, it was, just incredible. You had everybody from, the major logistics companies, wanting to partner with them so that they could provide better solutions to their own customers. And then obviously, the customer demand of people who wanted, greater insight into, what is the expected delivery time? Do we have, delay? Are there delays that, we need to anticipate, or, just what's kind of the current situation, and being able to have a dashboard for that. Great time for that to be out there.
Okay, and kind of a follow-up question. This is another question from the audience, which actually follows up to this, which is, how much visibility do you suggest that medtech companies have into their supplier inventory and scheduling systems? And what are best practices? What can we ask of our suppliers legitimately? So, Richelle, do you want to start, and then Joel?
Yeah, so I think that's something that, we assess when we first meet the supplier and do the supplier quality audit. Because even though you're there looking at quality, you're kind of looking at their whole system and their whole factory and saying, okay, how much, and you can innocently kind of ask the question during the audit, what's your throughput on this line? If you had to ramp up, what could you do? And we started having, I don't think that we had those kind of discussions and had that kind of eye on things like that before the pandemic, but it's definitely something that we do now. And, you always want to pick suppliers that would be willing to share that information with you. And if they're not, I think that would, that's a supplier where if they're the only game in town, you're going to want to have extra inventory on hand if you don't have a good, if they're not willing to share that information and you don't get a good sense that they're going to be able to provide what you need when you need it. So I think that would be my perspective on it is your supplier really should be a partner with you. And because that's who's going to work with you in the crunch when you really need something that, if they're your strong partner, they're going to do whatever they can to help you.
Joel?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the relationship and whether it's a good fit, from, is the supplier, going to have the inventory and are they going to work with you? I think that's, probably the most important. You can put in, notice of potential breaches, and then you can put in audit requirements. If you're one of the smaller customers and it's a major supplier, you might not be able to get those, and so that's where I think it comes down to from a practical standpoint, is it a good relationship, and is it someone that's going to tell you if they can't supply something and be willing to work with you on those.
Okay, so I want to ask some questions specifically. Often on PACT events, we have a lot of emerging technology and startup companies. So, what special advice do you have for companies who are, building their first product and building their first supplier relationships? Given what's happened this last couple of years and what continues to go on now with shortages, any advice there? So, Richelle, I'll just keep going.
Yeah. So, again, as I said, I think what's really important, especially when you're new, it may be hard to diversify your supply, right? Because you're small, you can't even fathom, getting a certain number of parts from one supplier, never mind trying to find that alternate source. So I think just design flexibility is one of the things that you can think about, because let's say, Lise, your board, you had to change. If you had designed the rest of your equipment to fit that specific board and you found a supplier who had something that was 1/4 of an inch bigger. So something where, you don't want to have a sloppy design, but you do want it to be flexible to be able to get other pieces to fit into it. So as much as you can kind of think about, don't make everything fit so tightly that you won't be able to do things. And then I think it really just comes down to, if you don't have the expertise in-house, so if you don't know how to do supply chain and you don't know how to build these relationships and what to look for in suppliers, tap into a network and, get that expertise. So whether it's contracting consultant or through something like this program where you make a connection, you're like, hey, I really don't know how to do this. Can you point me in the right direction? I think that's key for startups to do is to leverage networks so that they don't have to, learn everything that others in the industry may already know and be able to help them with.
Joel?
Yeah, as far as advice for startups, I think it's a great time for startups to make a pitch if they have the ability to provide something. I think a lot of people are reevaluating, their vendor relationships, maybe looking to diversify, and so you just have a lot of opportunity there. And one of the challenges that I think startups in particular faced in the medtech industry is like historically, a vendor qualification, part of that would be, are you financially sound? Are you going to be around in a few years? And I think that, there are a lot of small and medium-sized companies that have a lot of financial vulnerabilities now. And I think you see some of the larger organizations that are looking to source critical components, being more willing to work there. And actually, both from a strategic partnership, but also, we've seen corporate venture capital participating in actually making investments into suppliers and really looking to shore up their balance sheet. And I think that's a great thing. And that, so if you're a startup and you think there is a company out there that would be a natural fit, I think it's a great opportunity now to be making those pitches and to be trying to make those relationships.
So I just want to feedback what you're saying is that a lot of companies are now looking at M&A activity or investment activity, not just around revenue growth, but about actually shoring up their own supply chain and product availability, and that there may be opportunities created there. Is that?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think supply chain was always on the menu for business development units, and so certainly from an acquisition perspective, that's always something that you can either shore up your supply chain, or you can go look for new opportunities. I think with a lot of the uncertainty that's out there in the marketplace now, I think there's maybe a little bit more focus on shoring up what you need to continue your core business. I think there's maybe a little bit more hesitancy in more speculative ventures to start a new business line. But yeah, and I think the interesting thing I think about today is corporate venture capital has there's never been more corporate venture capital, and even just a number of local corporate venture capital funds that were announced just in the last few years, and those opportunities really weren't there in the global financial crisis or anything else. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to see how those play out, especially if there is a recession or what have you. So I definitely think that's an opportunity for startups as they're as they're going out there.
Great. So another question from the audience is that has there been are there some lessons learned in this time of shortage and about nearshoring and offshoring manufacturing? Are companies making different decisions? Should companies make different decisions given the number of boats in the Los Angeles harbor, right? Yeah. So, Richelle?
Yep. So I think some of the strategies that are definitely going to stay is trying to avoid sole sourcing. So either have multiple suppliers or have alternate parts from the same supplier. Because we spent a lot of time at the beginning of the pandemic when we found about component shortages, spent a lot of time. Okay, who are the other manufacturers? What other parts do you have that we could use that are similar? And so I think if you start thinking about that now, you're not going to have to, we pulled all of our resources off all our projects and put them all on this. So we had, cross-functional teams that were looking into this. And so I think one of the strategies that will go forward is avoiding, making sure that you have that alternate in your back pocket. Mm-hmm. And then as far as offshoring, we actually had sent one of our manufacturing lines to another manufacturer, as kind of security, so that if our workforce got sick or something happened in our plant, we had someone in another part of the world that was producing the equipment. And now they actually like that model so much that the company is going to open up their own facility off continent to do that and open up their own manufacturing facility offshore. So I think that, that is, I'm, firsthand seeing that it's continuing despite the supply chain issues that we're seeing right now and slowing down. People are trying to be creative in their sourcing and their manufacturing.
So offshoring is a risk if you're dependent on it, you can't get product in, but it's a safety measure if you're worried about making sure you have multiple manufacturing facilities.
Exactly.
Are you seeing this too, Joel, in your practice with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing we saw come up with offshore manufacturing was just the number of things that historically were, came in by boat, and people were willing to, put on a plane. And so, I mean, I think that changes the cost benefit analysis. Obviously it's much more expensive, but if it's a small part and a critical component, the additional cost to put on a plane and deliver on time, it may still work to produce offshore. And so I think you need to factor it into, the cost benefit analysis, but I think there are a lot of things that you can still produce, on an economically viable basis, even if you do have to, airship it in. And so, that's a change, to meet the same delivery timeframes that you may need, but I think you can make it work.
Okay. So, as we're getting close to the end of our time, I want to turn the focus a little bit to customers, to hospital customers. And, when you do get in a back order situation, as you mentioned, Joel, it isn't necessarily that the lawyers that are going to be the problem, but your clinical customers who are using the product. Any best practices or words of wisdom there? How transparent are people being? There's a balance, right, between being so transparent that your customers get worried about your ability and you lose your credibility, but at the same time, there's a matter of trust. Of you can't surprise people. So, Joel, thoughts on best practices, and then.
Yeah, I mean, I think you certainly want to at least plant seeds of what issues you are facing, and I think you can do it in a way that lets them know that you are facing challenges, and just set forth the strategy that what you're doing to try to overcome it. And if there's problems you haven't yet resolved, let them know, and they may have they may be willing to help you work through those. But I mean, if you have those conversations early, it won't come as a surprise when you've told them that you're experiencing a challenge, and to say your plan that you had in place to overcome those challenges isn't working out as you thought it might. I think that is a much softer and more gentle way to let them know that you're having challenges. And I don't think you need to come right out of the gate and say, we aren't sure if we're going to be able to deliver, a year from now. I think that, often is, probably too aggressive, but I definitely think, you can plant the seeds early, and just by staying in communication with them, there won't be any surprises.
Richelle?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to knowing your customer. And what we found was we kind of knew who we could trust and who would be like, okay, we're going to, stick through this with you. And, when you can deliver, we're, keeping your product. And then we knew which ones that would drop us like a hot potato and just go to the competitor, and we wouldn't be able to get that business back. Right. So we were really strategic, and, luckily we had our own sales force who was on the ground, knew the customers well. And we're like, okay, I know I can go to this customer and get 2 cases out of their inventory and bring it to this customer because they can wait, because I know that, what they're seeing. Or I know if we call them and say, hey, we're going to be delayed shipping you by 3 weeks, they're going to be like, okay, we love your product. We're going to wait. We'll figure it out. And, we know that you'll help us. And then there were others where we're like, okay, they're going to tell us to take all our equipment out if we go and tell them that we can't deliver. And so we factored in our customer knowledge when we were saying, okay, where are the shipments going this week and who's getting how much, and having those conversations internally and making sure we were all squared away before we went out to the customers and shared the information with them.
So you were, and in that case, it was during the pandemic, and people kind of got it that the product was in short supply.
And I think that carries through anyway, though, because you're still, even today, even, if there's a short supply, and even if it's not the pandemic and for some reason you can't supply your product, you're going to want to know, okay, which customers are going to ride through this with us because they're really our partners, and which ones are, okay, they're bigger, so we don't want to lose the business because it'll, pay dividends down the end. And, that's where really getting to know your customers and your customer base is critical, especially for a startup.
Mm-hmm. Those are difficult decisions, I think, for startups to make. Want to talk a little bit, about the financial ramifications and sort of bigger companies can absorb this more. Smaller companies, it's harder. The prices of it's not just availability, but anytime there's shortages, prices are going up dramatically. How do you talk to investors, or I guess theoretically the street, if you're a public company, about what's going on? And we're often contractually locked in to pricing. So as we talked about earlier, kind of squeezed in that process. Have you seen companies having to have these hard conversations, Joel? Is this something that you?
Yeah, definitely. As far as communicating to investors go, at a startup level, I think it's, most frequently at the board level, but even just in investor updates. Mm-hmm. And I think, most startups are not profitable. And so it isn't really going to be a surprise that if you continue to be unprofitable. But what I think is extremely important is to be realistic in, unit economic projections. Because I think what investors are going to be most interested in is, are you now in a position where it just doesn't make sense to continue what you're doing? Or are you going to be able to, continue to, are you going to be able to work through it? And so, you kind of need to go to your customers and see how much of the price increase they're going to be willing to absorb. Go to your vendors and see what you can do to reduce costs, and if you can design around it. And I think you just need to be realistic with what the new unit economics are, and if it continues to be profitable. And I think that the investors will, every startup has optimistic financial projections, and so investors are, used to that. But I think the more, realistic you are in those projections, I think that'll just build credibility with investors.
Mm-hmm. Richelle?
Yeah, I was going to say the whole, the credibility around gross margin, like what you project, especially if you're, a public company, what you've projected your gross margin is going to be. And, if you're a startup and going to investors, you don't want to go to them with the best case scenario of everything going right. I think, just like in the design world, when you're going to investors, you want to plan for things not going according to plan. And so maybe be a little bit more conservative. And I know that's kind of the total opposite of what a startup is all about, where a startup, it's all risk, but you want to be a little bit conservative in what you think you're going to be able to do, because then, you'll have a more realistic chance of meeting it. And I think meeting expectations with investors is a big thing. If you can exceed them, great, but at a minimum, you want to meet them. So, you have to kind of hold yourself back, which is, I said, not typical of a startup. And when you're kind of figuring out what you can do and how much it's going to cost you to do something.
Great. Okay, so we're coming down to time. So last question. In the world after the pandemic and after the post-pandemic shortages, what does the world look like in medtech? What are the long-standing changes that are really going to impact and reshape the business? Let's start with Joel and then end with Richelle. So, Joel?
Sure. Well, I think at least in the medium term, I think you're going to see customers really value their suppliers a lot more. And I think there's going to be a lot more of partnership, between the customer and supplier. And, hopefully there will be just a lot more thought given to what will make a successful partnership. I would like to say that's going to be long term, but I think that, it may be the case that after, 10 years, and we've, moved on from the pandemic world, I don't know how much people will move on from that. But hopefully, at least in the medium term, I think that will be a large theme we see, at least over the next few years.
Richelle?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think you're going to see more companies trying to enter the medtech space. I think they got kind of a taste of it during the pandemic. And so I think they're like, oh, we can do this. So I think there's going to be more people trying to be in the space. On the positive side, I mean, FDA is still going to be FDA. There's, you still never know what they're going to ask. But I think I've seen more of a spirit of cooperation and communication because, before this, I could never have imagined, FDA coming out at the beginning of 2022 with something that, you're going to have 180 days notice and essentially giving you what's going to probably be about a year's notice of this happening. Usually FDA is like, okay, here, you've got 2 months to do this. And everybody is like scrambling to try and catch up with what they're doing. So I think that they're trying to be a little bit more thoughtful of the impact that they have on industry and companies. Whether or not that's going to be long lasting, I'm hopeful, but I don't have a crystal ball. So I think that that's definitely one of the positive I've seen is a lot more kind of communicative atmosphere with FDA than before, where that they really are trying to be helpful and be least burdensome. They've always had that kind of least burdensome phrase, but I've never really seen it. And this was the first time that I did, and I'm hoping that that continues.
That's interesting. So it sounds like, what we're saying with both supplier relationships, customer relationships, regulatory relationships, that we've been through this spirit of having to collaborate to problem solve as a larger network and as an industry as a whole, and that we think that that may have some longstanding effects and how the business goes forward, and that would be great. That would really be a silver lining to what has been some very, very difficult